Welcome, and thank you for joining us as we embark on a journey to discover how our resort community has become an innovative technological center. I am Mary Czar, Executive Director of the Boca Raton Historical Society and Museum.
And I'm Gianna Passanelli, Marketing Director for Crocker Partners and owner of the beautiful park that you see behind us, Boca Raton Innovation Campus, former IBM campus and birthplace of the first personal computer. Together, we have partnered to bring you Boca Raton Tech Talks, which aim to dissect the evolution of technology and innovation in Boca Raton.
We want to answer the question, why did these companies choose Boca Raton as their home base? Our conversation, a three-part series, will unfold the strategy behind some of Boca Raton's most impactful innovations, and we hope that this will mean something really special for the future of technology in our community.
All four cameras are a go. I am rolling. Stand by. All right, so let's go in 3, 2.
Hi there, my name is Susan Gillis and I'm the curator of the Boca Raton Historical Society and Museum, and I want to welcome you to panel 1 of Boca Raton Tech Talks, the evolution of tech and innovation in Boca Raton. Today we are filming at BRIC, the Boca Raton Innovation Campus, who are our partners in Tech Talks. And you may know that this wonderful, outstanding building was designed by Marcel Breuer and Robert Gatchie for IBM Boca Raton and dedicated in 1970. Our guests on our panel today include Ms. Sally Ling, an author and local historian, the author of many books on local history, who will be talking a little bit about radar and the Boca Raton Army Airfield during World War II. Also joining us will be Dr. Dave Bradley, an engineer, a former employee of IBM, longtime employee with IBM, who is a man of many accomplishments, but perhaps best known for his work on the design of the original IBM PC, which is the ancestor of all PC computers, as well as writing the code for Control-Alt-Delete, which all PC users know and love. So to begin with, I would like to ask Sally to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work as a historian.
I moved to Tampa, Florida in 1966 and moved to South Florida in 1970. And I wasn't really interested in too much history until I started working for the Sun Sentinel as a special correspondent. And when they asked me to write an article about the Boca Raton Army Airfield and the buildings that were left on it, that was my first real jump into Florida history. And it was a fascinating jump. And since then, I have written 17 books. I've had 3 documentaries made relating to the subjects of my books. And I have been writing for 15 years and will continue to do so. Many of it is nonfiction, like the history of Florida, but a lot of it is fiction. But I include always in my fiction books a history of Florida in some capacity.
Well, we appreciate that at the Historical Society. So the Boca Raton Army Airfield sort of led into your second career or next career, right?
It did. It was the catalyst for sure.
Okay, very good. And Dave, tell us a little bit about your background, sir.
Well, I came to Boca late. It wasn't until 1975 after I got my PhD from Purdue and was hired by IBM. I didn't even know they had a facility here because I was interviewed by a guy from Watson Research Center up in New York. I got a phone call saying, come down and interview. I said, where's Boca? We had to get out the road atlas, look it up. Came down here, interviewed, they offered me a job, and I'm really glad I came here. Mm-hmm. I always seemed to work on the smallest machines that IBM was working on. Series 1 was one of the first products that actually was developed here locally, and I had a small part in that. And then in 1978, I moved into one of the small outlying buildings over by the interstate, where we did the System 23 Datamaster. And of course that led to the IBM PC and the explosive growth. I've worked in all sorts of buildings around here and really enjoyed my time with IBM here in Boca.
Well, you also have served as an adjunct professor, is that correct?
Yes, Florida Atlantic University was fairly small back in 1975. In fact, there were only 4 faculty members in the electrical engineering department. My boss, Tom Harrison, who was sort of one of the pioneers down here, was very close to them, said they're looking for a guy to teach electromagnetic field theory, which is far removed from computers and anything I'd done. I said, okay, I'll do that. And so for the next 20 years, I'd teach 1 or 2 courses every semester over at FAU. That was great fun.
And you're an author as well, right?
Well, I've written a book, Assembly Language Programming for the IBM PC. I doubt that it has the same range of viewers or readers that Sally's books
Maybe
do.
not in the public library, eh?
I don't know whether they have one here or not. The FAU library had one.
Oh, very
I knew that.
good. Very good. Okay, let's start off our discussion with Sally. Please tell us what the heck is radar and a little bit about its applications during World War II.
Radar, well, actually before World War II, Germany and Britain both had radar, but it was very crude, and it was basically used from ground to air to look for incoming aircraft. So it wasn't really very well developed, and it was certainly not it was a defensive tactic. So the Britons at the time were under heavy fire from the Germans during the early part of World War II. And they were trying to develop a device that would be like a second generation of the devices that they already had. But this device would actually go from aircraft to aircraft or air to ground. And so that was quite an innovation for them. They were trying to develop it, and they actually had developed it. It was called a resonant cavity magnetron. The only problem was with all of the bombing, they couldn't perfect the device. So they sent a group of people called the Tizard Mission over to the United States. It was built of military and scientists, and they came to the United States to ask for our help to further research and develop this device, because they weren't able to do it with all of the activity in the air and the buildings coming down around them. And so the United States agreed that they would cooperate and partner with this group, and they chose MIT as the place for the research and development lab. It was called the RAD lab, and it was blacked out the windows, and it went 24/7, and scientists from all over the United States were asked to come to this facility in order to help them perfect this device.
And what radar is an acronym, correct?
Yes.
So what does that stand for?
Radio.
Detecting and ranging? And kind of tell us a little bit what that technology is.
Yes, the device, the resonant cavity magnetron, was hinged on microwave research, and this was the first of its kind. So before that, if an aircraft wanted to see a target, it was a very wide range that they were looking at. And in fact, they couldn't really pinpoint the target. They actually had to have visual perception of the target in order to bomb it. So if you had heavy cloud cover, or if it was in night, you couldn't even see the target. And so this device allowed them to see the target during the day, during the night, and under heavy cloud cover. And that kept our Allied planes safe from any aircraft devices, munitions, and also from fighters in the sky.
So you would say that the onset of World War II really escalated the technology?
Absolutely. The onset of World War II absolutely escalated the technology regarding this device.
Mm-hmm. How was it used? Boca Raton became, we know, a radar training base. Tell us a little bit about that.
The device was being perfected at MIT, but unfortunately it had terrible weather during the winter, which is when they were perfecting the device at the RAD lab. And so they needed a place that was isolated close to the ocean so they could do bombing runs, and a place that perhaps they hoped would already have an airfield there. And Boca Raton fit the bill. They had a grass airfield that was built in 1930, although it was very small. And obviously we have the ocean right off our front door. And so Boca Raton became the ideal selection for the airfield and for the military installation.
And was it the only radar school in the country?
No, there were other radar schools, but it was the only one in the country that actually trained people in the use, maintenance, and operation of airborne radar, which the cavity magnetron device eventually became.
I see. Dr. Dave, I want to ask you a couple questions. Tell us a little bit about IBM Boca Raton, why you think they came to Boca Raton back in the 60s, and what they were doing back then.
Well, the 60s was a little before my time. I was in school back then. But my understanding is IBM was looking to expand beyond their ancestral roots in New York. And so they moved to a number of places, many of them warm weather, like Boca Raton, Tucson, Arizona, where my sister went to work, actually, and Austin, Texas, as an example. I think the company was trying to expand. They could put their manufacturing and development plants in lots of areas that way. The perhaps apocryphal story is that Thomas Watson Jr., the CEO of IBM, had a house in Palm Beach, and by building a site here, that gave him a way to write off his trips down to Palm Beach in order to visit the IBM facility here. The only real requirements IBM had were you needed to have a university nearby, and Florida Atlantic fit that bill, and you need to have railroad access, and we've got plenty of railroads here. In fact, you can still see the spur line that came in here for the manufacturing facility. So I think that's why we ended up in Boca.
I think maybe relatively inexpensive land back then, eh?
Yeah.
Not today.
Yes.
And-
Although it seemed expensive to me as a brand new person earning a wage coming down here and looking at buying some place to live. It didn't seem cheap even back in 1975.
Wow. Well, Sally, I want to go back to you and ask you, can you tell us about some of the radar applications that were taught here? Ground control approach and so on?
Yes, well, the two were obviously the airborne radar. That was the device that was put into the B-17s that could detect submarines and small pinpoint targets. But the other one was ground control approach. That was the precursor of allowing a radar device or the individuals to guide planes into a landing field.
That sounds pretty important to me.
It was very important and was extremely important during the Berlin airlift when they used it to bring the sorties into with life-saving supplies to the Germans.
And there were countermeasures here as well? Countermeasure radar, so that's a defensive device?
All of this was really, they were defensive before that. It expanded on the defense, but it also made it offensive now.
So both offense and defense for the war effort,
Yes,
correct?
yes.
Correct. And radar, my understanding is it was still top secret during World War II. Is that correct?
It was extremely top secret. The men who were sent to the Boca Raton Army Airfield were not told where they were going or why they were going. They just showed up and then they were told. Those that attended classes, training classes, were not allowed to write anything down. Everything had to be memorized. And they were not allowed to use the word radar off the base. It was a criminal offense if they did so, and they could be punished very severely. In fact, they probably were kicked down to infantry if they did such a thing.
And tell me a little bit about the soldiers who learned about radar. Did they sign up for that? Were they appointed? How did they choose the students?
Well, they were given tests, but most of them had already gone through radio school, so they had been trained already in the use of radio, and this was just an extension of what they had already learned.
This sounds like a great challenge. I mean, to me, it's a fairly complicated technology. The basic idea is fairly simple, but to read about it, I get crossed eyes. Certainly that was a challenge for a lot of these youngsters who maybe didn't grow up with a telephone, much less a radio.
Well, in the past, originally, the images were done in shades of gray, black for buildings, gray for trees and bushes and that sort of thing. But when they actually were able to pinpoint the target, things became a lot more specific, and so they were able to see their targets much better and to know when to drop the bombs.
And I guess the technology advanced rapidly during the war as well, did it not?
Oh yes, quite a bit, but obviously this was a push to get this device into the aircraft, and also a push to advance it. And then of course, once they realized what they had, they just took off with it, and it went like gangbusters in development.
Well, Dr. Dave, tell us a little bit, what do you know about maybe those technologies? What was going on here at the IBM campus in Boca in the 60s, 70s, maybe when you came on board? We all know about the IBM PC, but IBM's responsible for a lot of other computer technologies, but other technologies as well. Please tell us about that.
Well, when I first arrived here, I was working on Series 1, which was an IBM mini computer. Digital Equipment Corporation and Data General were starting to eat away at IBM's mainframe business with these smaller computers, so IBM wanted to have a response to that. Prior to that, there had been the IBM System 7, which was also a mini computer-oriented one, but a little bigger, a little bulkier. Of course, the technology was older at that time. IBM also had other projects going in here. One of the most famous ones, Don Rex, who became an IBM fellow, had developed the dot matrix printer, which for those of us who now only use inkjets, you don't remember it, but whenever you hear things going bzz, 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 that was a dot matrix printer which used wires as hammers to pound into the paper, and that was being developed here. In fact, the early manufacturing line was devoted to turning out the low-end Model 360s, which was the product transferred from San Jose, the initial seed mission for this location, and Don Rex's printers.
Wonderful. And when you say mini computer, what size are you talking about?
About the size of a refrigerator.
Okay.
You want to figure about 6 feet high, 2 to 3 feet wide.
And what would have been the uses of those computers to the general public? How would they be used?
Well, the general public wouldn't buy one.
Right.
It was, in those days, $25,000 to $50,000 to sort of get started in a mini computer, which is hundreds of thousands now. But it was where you wanted to put a mini computer to control a process. For example, you wanted to put it out on the manufacturing line and keep track of things which were going on there. You couldn't do it like a 360 inside a raised floor, chilled air room attended to by acolytes wearing their white coats. This was a machine that would sit out there where people would actually be using it. One of the biggest sales of mini computers predating the personal computer realm was Series 1s were sold for use in State Farm insurance agents' offices. This predates the idea of a personal computer, and this was sort of a half-size one, think the R2-D2 version of a mini computer. And they put these in State Farm insurance agents' office so that they could communicate with the home office, but they could also manage all of their paperwork and stuff there.
Let's go back to Sally for a minute. The Boca Raton Army Airfield, what kind of effect did that have on the community, the coming of this airfield? Tell us, how large was it? How did it impact the community?
The Boca Raton Army Airfield was almost 6,000 acres. So it ran from Palmetto Park Road north to Yamato Road, which is the correct name of the road. And it ran from the east side from Dixie all the way over to what is now 95. So it was a very, very large parcel of land, and on the land was everything. There were commissaries and PXs and day rooms and administrative buildings and the airfield, of course, and hangars. And so these buildings that were put up, 800 plus buildings that were put up for this base, after the troops came and went, in about 1947, the base actually closed. But these buildings were the catalyst, really, that brought people into Boca Raton, because the buildings were already here. And as the government sold off the land and sold off the buildings, people purchased them for apartments and businesses. And so there were people who were able to come down already and occupy these buildings. And that's really how the growth of Boca Raton continued after World War II. But all of South Florida blossomed after the war. Every community down here was filled with people who loved the weather and loved the climate and loved the existence of the warmness of South Florida. And so, just like all post-war building booms, South Florida was one of the biggest.
How many soldiers do you believe that were stationed at the base? I mean, how many people were stationed there during the war, do you think?
At the height of capacity, there were 16,000 troops on the base.
Wow. And how big was Boca Raton as a town?
It had about 700 people. Quite a difference.
So quite an impact, economic impact on the community, right?
Great economic impact.
And how many years was the base functioning?
It functioned from 1942 to 1947. There was a Category 4 hurricane that came through in 47 and knocked a lot of the buildings down. However, the CBS buildings, concrete buildings, remained in place, and those were the ones that then were sold off for other uses.
And did some of those veterans return to Boca Raton or stay in Boca Raton?
Lots of the veterans returned. When I wrote the book, I was amazed at how many veterans we could find that were in the area, and it was, of course, I'd say all of them are deceased now, but it was a wonderful time when they could look back on their time in Boca Raton at the airfield and just reminisce about how wonderful it was.
And tell us the name of your book, please.
The book is called Small Town, Big Secrets, Inside the Boca Raton Army Airfield during World War II.
And that's very available to anybody who's interested. I'd give you a little plug there.
Thanks.
Dave, okay, so let's talk about the IBM PC. What a thrilling project we have with hindsight. But tell us what it was like at the time. How did you get involved with that? How did IBM get involved with that?
Well, the story goes back to about the time I joined IBM. Smaller computers were beginning to appear in corporations that ran big 360 computers. And the IBM salesman would show up and they'd see these other computers sitting around, these mini computers from Digital Equipment, for example. And that's how IBM started drifting into mini computers, because they wanted to have a full range of solutions. And then Intel and the invention of the microprocessor, the ability to do all the processing power of a large computer in a small chip this size, suddenly made a personal computer relevant. Once again, the IBM salesmen are going through the companies that they sell to, and they're seeing non-IBM equipment in there. Where it should be an IBM terminal, it's a machine built by somebody naming their product for fruit and stuff like that. And he said, we need to fix that. The first project in that regard eventually became known as the System 23 Datamaster. That started, at least for me, in February of 1978, based upon an Intel microprocessor. The whole idea was, let's buy parts off the shelf and use that to create a computer. We should be able to do it faster, perhaps even cheaper, and we can compete against these others. The Datamaster had a number of problems, some of it cultural, some of it technological, and it turns out that the Datamaster didn't get announced until July of 1981, just 2 weeks before the IBM PC. And Frank Carey and a number of the, Frank Carey was the CEO at that time, and a number of others saw that our response was going to be inadequate and too slow. They put together a group, said, how can we do this faster? Put us in a building off to the side, seated it with people from the Datamaster project. I like to tell all the people who ask me technical questions, you know, why did the PC do this? 99% of the time the answer is because that's the way the Datamaster did it. Our goal was to do it in 1 year. For IBM, that was a nanosecond type of response. Typically, it was 5 to 10 years to bring out a new product. And so we did everything fast. Hopefully we did it well. And it was that focus that allowed us to do it. Now, for those of us working on it, it was a great deal of fun because we were all true believers in personal computers. Many of us had something that we had put together on our own. I even had a Z80 based computer that I had built and played around with, but I got my fill of that at work with the Datamaster as time went by. The other nifty thing is that it was a clean sheet of paper. Didn't say, well, you have to build the next IBM 360 or the next Series 1, so it has to conform to that. Essentially, it was build a personal computer, and we got to make those decisions. Engineers love that idea that you can go do that. And the final thing we found out after it was announced, if you worked on a 360, you were never going to be able to take your wife and kids and say, that's the part I worked on, because how many people get access to the raised floor, chilled air room? No, but here you could go into the store, or maybe you even bought one and took the covers off and said, that's the part I did right there. I worked on this.
Yes.
And that's a great deal. So it turned out that working on the PC was a great opportunity for a number of different reasons.
And I understand it wasn't IBM's usual practice that you had this open source architecture. Is that the correct term?
IBM opening up was fairly new for them. You have to remember this is the IBM of the 360s and 370s and the antitrust case which is going on, which related very much to the openness of the machine. So the concept of making a machine that was more open, that used a processor not made by IBM, that used an operating system not written by IBM. Those were very brand new things. And then we published it all in the technical reference manual, as if we were inviting people to clone our machine. The real reason we did it is, even as big as IBM, you couldn't build all the adapter cards and write all the programs that this machine would allow. So we invited the industry to participate with us, and they did in spades. But we also sort of opened it up for clones.
Indeed, interesting outcome. Tell us a little bit about the other people working on the design of the PC. Who do you remember? Who did you enjoy working with?
Well, all of them were pretty nifty to work with because there were a lot of very bright people there. There is, of course, this mythical 12, which started the IBM, and maybe for a period of a month there were 12 of us, and I was the last of those 12, not the founder, one of the last, because they found out that Microsoft required a BIOS prepared for them, and so that's why I got drug in. But we had guys who figured out how to build the case. And this is a brand new thing for IBM, that we're going to bend metal like this and build this own little thing. We went to Lexington, Kentucky, IBM, in order to get the keyboard pieces. We had a couple of guys taking diskette drives from the outside world. In fact, if there was a pair of guys who deserved to be working together, it was Bill Tutt and Bill Ott. T-U-T-T and O-T-T. I figured later on in their career, they both worked for a guy named Gary Pitt, P-I-T-T. I figured that, you know, who else could you put in that department? That was pretty much it. And of course, Patty McHugh, one of the 12 working on it, and she was one of the designers of the personal computer motherboard. A South Florida story, Noel Falwell was concerned with the layout, the printed circuit board. Noel had been born in Fort Lauderdale, raised in this area, hired by IBM here, came in as one of the original 12. His first assignment was to get this printed circuit board laid out, and to do that he had to go visit the vendor in Toronto, Canada, in January. And he said it was a whole new meaning to his life. The first time he walked to the elevator there, went out to push the button, and a 1-inch spark jumped from his fingertip to the elevator. He said, we don't have that in South Florida. But we did get a printed circuit board built. So lots of interesting war stories from that.
Yes.
Perhaps the best story from that, there was a guy in the planning department named Larry Crismond. And us engineers were kind of kept away from the press when they announced it August 12, 1981, because engineers will always say, well, you know, we could have done this and we could have done this. And the salesman just wants you to say, it's the best thing since sliced bread. Larry Crismond is a planner, salesman kind of guy. So after the announcement, we're up there at the U-shaped building in Delray. They did Coke and cookies out in the entry area there, you know, to celebrate the announcement. And Larry Crismond gets up there with his banjo and sings, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way." That was a wonderful cap to the announcement of the IBM PC.
Okay, wonderful. And of course, we can't fail to mention that a very young Bill Gates was part of that team. That's correct?
Yes, I like to say I met Bill when he was worth only millions.
Yeah.
I delivered the very first IBM personal computer prototype to Microsoft, December 1st, 1980. I showed up there. The guy who answered the door was Steve Ballmer, who later went on to become the CEO of the company. So I thought he had a pretty good career from receptionist to CEO like that. But I met Bill, had a number of meetings with him because it's his software that works with my BIOS, and we had to make sure all the slots and tabs matched up. So I believe out of the engineering group, I made more trips to Bellevue, Washington than anybody else. And there's no two places further apart in the continental United States than Boca Raton, Florida and Bellevue, Washington.
So you got to know him a little bit, eh?
Yeah, I got to know Bill quite well, both in the PC and then the XT development, which came along later. And he was very focused, extremely bright, very passionate about his work, and you could just, in his body language, see his intensity. You'd be in a meeting and he'd be there rocking back and forth, just somewhere to displace his nervous energy as he's focusing on the problem and how we're going to fix these things.
And I'm getting a little head into our next panel, but IBM continued to work with Microsoft on various projects after the PC, isn't that correct?
Yeah, up through OS2 and well into late 80s, early 90s, we were working with Microsoft. That was sort of the other side of the business. I was more in the metal part, and those were more in the bits part, if you will, of the business. But yeah, they continued working with him until we got our influx of OS 360 and IBM System 360 kind of people to show up, and then there was sort of a clash.
I see.
You know, Microsoft wanted to go one way, IBM wanted to go another.
It was an interesting partnership, though. Very interesting when you think about it.
It was very interesting. I think it worked out well for both of us. One only has to say, well, what happened with CPM 86, which was the dominant operating system at the time. They weren't interested in working with IBM, and Bill Gates was.
And And thus is history, yes?
Yes, it's just on little things like that
That's
that
why
it all turns.
Most of us have PCs. Sally, I want to get back to you. And we talked a little bit about the effects the base had on Boca Raton. Did the community interact with the base during the war? And, you know, what was that like? That must have been kind of weird.
In two capacities, a lot of the workers came from outside the base. So we had a number of civilians that were in the community, in the South Florida community, that worked on the base. And the other thing was that the base personnel obviously frequented the businesses that were in Boca Raton and the South Florida area. So there was a lot of interaction, but as far as anybody really knowing what happened on the base, the civilians didn't know, and quite honestly, a lot of the troops didn't know.
So there were other people stationed here. There were, other than students, there were other people stationed at Boca Raton. What kind of?
Oh, of course. I mean, they had a full cadre of support facilities: the hospital, the PX, the base exchange PX. Obviously, they ate on the base, so they had a lot of food and that sort of thing that were brought in.
It was its own town.
It was its own town. It was a big town, certainly bigger than Boca Raton.
Briefly, Dr. Dave, tell us a little bit. I mean, the PC, when we look back, it was such a wonderful thing for IBM. Were you surprised? Was IBM surprised at the success of the PC?
I think we were all surprised. Yeah, guys like Mel Hallerman said, oh yeah, I know it's going to be big. I knew it from the beginning. But most of us, I think, were quite surprised that it became as successful as it did. I know I was. I always go back to the first anniversary of the PC they're in New Jersey, the same place they do the Miss America pageant. In fact, the week before it, they had a conference in a hotel ballroom. And 1 year after the PC announced, this ballroom is filled with people selling cards to go in the PC and programs to run on the PC. And PC Magazine literally has come out, starting about this thick, and then they would send out twice a month a Manhattan phone book sized magazine to you. It was then realized this thing is huge. It's going to take over the world. And the good news is the world loved us. The bad news is the rest of IBM loved us. And suddenly the rest of IBM descends and says, we want to build stuff just like you do. Tell us how.
So do you think IBM ever regretted not paying Bill Gates and saying, hey, we want your operating system? I mean, I hear that discussed much among retired engineers.
Yeah, one can make arguments both ways, that if we had owned the operating system, we would have had much greater control. If we had owned the processor, we would have had much greater control. But I think that misses the issue of how much the PC's success is owed to the participation of everybody else, all those people at the conference 1 year later. If they had thought this was a proprietary IBM system, like the Datamaster, which was announced about at the same time, or the 5100, yeah, there'd be some business participants with us, but everybody wouldn't have joined in. And it was that open system that allowed that to happen. So it would have been very different in lots of different ways.
And perhaps not as successful.
Perhaps not as successful.
Yeah, amazing.
But in hindsight, and I can't say that I had this thought at the time, maybe what we should have done is licensed the BIOS rather than requiring companies like Compaq or Phoenix, which developed their own BIOS. If we had done that, we would have still maintained a portion of what's integral to the system. And then we could have participated a little more fully in the expansion. But counter to that, at that time, IBM's in an antitrust suit, and they don't want to make the underlying operating system stuff. The equivalent of the BIOS in a 360, they don't want to make that available. So consequently, IBM as a company says, no, we don't want to do that. So that was part of the blessing and the curse, is that we were part of the IBM Corporation.
Well, this has been wonderful. I want to thank our guests, Sally, Dave, about two amazing, different technological stories, but very much part of our Boca Raton history. And thank you all our viewers for joining panel 1 of Boca Raton Tech Talks.